When you're ready to stuff your softie, we are going to take it by the opening. And this needs to be done gently because you can rip out stitches, but we're going to turn it inside out. So our stitches are now inside the softie. So again, gentle, because I'm already starting to rip some of my stitches. And we can do some repair if that happens. But this is why your small stitches are super duper important. I'm using my hand inside to gently push these seams outward. Don't panic if a seam rips. Again, we can fix that. If you have hard to reach places, you can use the eraser end of a pencil as long as you are doing that very gently. So I've got it turned inside out. And now I've got a couple handfuls of stuffing. This comes from the Fiber Center. And I'm going to grab a pencil to help push the stuffing in. So I'm going to take a few clumps and I'm going to separate it so it's a little fluffier. And then I'm going to add small amounts through that opening. And I'm going to use the eraser end of my pencil, make sure it's clean, to push it back into the edges of my seams. Don't be tempted to overstuff your softie or pillow. If you put too much stuffing, it will be hard to close up that opening. So again, fluff it and then stuff it in there. Use that pencil to push that stuffing back into your pillow or softie. And you should be able to squish the opening closed. If not, you have too much and you need to take some stuffing out. So I have a little bit more space in here. And I'm going to kind of push it away from that opening because the next thing we're going to do is stitch this closed. So again, make sure you can press those together without it being overstuffed. And I can still slide my stuffing around. I probably could add a tiny bit more. Any extra stuffing, make sure it gets back into the Fiber Center, not on the floor. Again, make sure your workspace is clean because if we get paint and glue on this, then no one else can use it. To close this opening, you'll need to make sure your needle is threaded, not at the end. And we are going to do a small part at a time. So I'm going to fold these inward. And you can do a whip stitch or a running stitch. I think the running stitch is sometimes a little bit neater looking, but sometimes the whip stitch is easier. So as I stitch, I'm going to continue pinching these sides together. And because I chose a dark blue, my stitches will show up. If you don't like that, check out the Fiber Center and find some other types of thread. I'm going to pull that tight again. And this can be kind of tricky, so if you're having a hard time pinching it, this is where using a paper clip will make this job a little bit easier. So I'm folding it in and then pressing it together, and that's going to make a nice seam that lines up with the other seam I've already done. And I left my opening kind of big, so this would be a good reason why maybe we should have kept sewing. Pull that tight, not so tight that we break the thread. And you will keep going all the way along this seam until you get to the end and then tie it off the way we have before. When you get to the end of your opening, we're going to tie off our thread. And to do that, you're going to find the closest stitch that you just did, slide your needle through, and that makes a loop. Catch the loop with your hand, and then take your needle and put it around and behind and through that loop. And when you pull it tight, you get a knot. We want to do that at least 2 or 3 times to make sure you have a knot. And my needle just came unthreaded. Make sure when you're sewing, you're always holding it by the eye of the needle. So I'm going to quickly rethread this. I'm not using the needle threader, but it's always a good idea to use those needle threaders. Okay, loop it around through. I'm going to hold it by the eye of the needle. I'm going to pull it tight. Once you've done that a couple times, we're going to cut the thread off right above the knot. Be careful not to cut your fabric. And my cloud pillow kind of turned into almost what I would say is like a creature. So if this happens, feel free to change plans and do something else. So I'm going to get some things to decorate and finish this pillow. For some reason, this reminded me of a little porcupine. So I got some scrap felt out of the scrap fabric box, and I got some beads out of the treasure chest. And I'm going to sew one of these beads on as an eye and sew some felt on as little spikes and feet. So if we're going to attach a bead, thread your needle, tie a knot at the end, and we're going to slide the needle through the fabric wherever you want the eye to, or the bead to go. And I'm going to pull that all the way to the knot, and then I'm going to take the bead and slide it over my needle. So whatever bead you choose, your needle needs to fit through it. I'm going to hold this with my other hand, the one I'm not sewing with, and then I'm going to catch the fabric right underneath the bead, slide it through the bead, and pull that tight, and that makes a little thread loop. And I'm going to do this a couple more times. If you don't like your thread showing, you can choose a color thread that closely matches your fabric or your bead. Spin it around, and we're going to do this on the other side. You could also use liquid tempera paint to paint your creatures. That paint is washable though, so if you ever wash your creature, it will come off. And then when we're done and the bead does not wiggle anymore, we make a loop. We slide our needle through that loop and you pull it tight. So we're making a knot, tying it off. Do that twice, cut your thread. Now if you want to sew any fabric, we can use what's called a whip stitch to attach pieces of fabric. So maybe I'm going to make a little foot. So to do that, I'm going to position my foot, and this is, again, we're using binder clips or paper clips can be helpful. I'm going to put my needle in underneath the felt so that the knot is underneath the fabric and we don't see it. And then I'm going to do what's called a whip stitch to attach this on. And a whip stitch goes from the underside of the fabric. So I pull that tight, under, whenever you're sewing, you want to try and keep your stitches nice and small. Smaller stitches will be stronger. Part of the reason I'm using this dark thread is so you can see what I'm doing. So again, if you don't want your thread to show, you may choose a different color that more closely matches your fabric. So the whip stitch uses the under, under, under pattern. If I wiggle this, it still moves, but it's not going to come off. When I'm done, I find the closest stitch, slide my needle through that stitch before I pull the loop tight, make a knot. You always want to do this 2 or 3 times to make sure your knot stays. And I cut that off. You can also do this if you want to sew a piece of fabric completely onto your creature, your pillow, your softie. Using the whip stitch, I'm going to sew from underneath. I'm not going all the way through the pillow. Mrs. Hayes' knot was not quite big enough. Sometimes if you make a small knot, it'll slide right through your fabric, and you need to make a bigger knot. We're putting the knot under the fabric so you don't see that little messy knot. And then I can just use the whip stitch to attach this piece of fabric to the top side of my pillow only. Careful not to catch your whip stitch on other things. And again, when you're sewing, we always want to try and keep our stitches about the same size, nice and small. Smaller stitches will be stronger. You can change the size of your stitch based on where you place your needle. So if I put my needle closer to the edge of this orange fabric, my stitch will be smaller. So a much smaller stitch that time. And then you're going to continue all the way around so that this is attached to your fabric.